This week, Doug White will join us for the show and talk about security threats from virtual machines. After that, we're going to try and bring on John Strand, who's teaching in Orlando this week, to talk about the security news, where we will cover headlines from SolarWinds, VMware, RiskIQ, GFI Software, Sonotype, NGINX, and Qualys. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. The teleprompter now has artificial intelligence, Doug, and updates itself. It's awesome. This week, and talk about them as it relates to enterprise security. You're going to do great.
I think that people think that you and I talk like every day at night. You know, It's like, hey, what are you doing? It's kind of a bit of an exhausting week. And I think that we noticed that a little bit in the stories for this week as well.
Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/Security Weekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. Stop attackers from domain credential theft and lateral movement with a 99% success rate by using artificial intelligence to control the attacker's perception of the environment. Javelin Networks is the world's first endpoint intrusion containment platform to protect domain networks. Javelin detects targeted attacks and breaches by obfuscating Active Directory, domain controllers, domain identities, domain credentials, and all domain resources. It only takes one compromised machine to jeopardize the entire organization. Don't be a victim. Visit javelin-networks.com and request a demo of AD Protect today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer's sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. Minerva Labs stops malware that traditional antivirus solutions cannot block. Minerva works with your existing anti-malware tools to stop evasive threats by deceiving them into a dormant state, dramatically increasing your rate of prevention. Minerva's solution does not require ongoing care and feeding and will not get in the way of business users. With Minerva, adversaries have to pick their poison, implement evasive tactics and get caught by Minerva, or don't employ evasion and get stopped by AV. To learn more and request a demo, visit minerva-labs.com today. Welcome, everyone, to episode 86 of Enterprise Security Weekly for Wednesday, April 4th, 2018. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, here in the comfy G-Unit Studios. Alongside me is none other than Dr. Doug White. What's up, Doug?
It's comfy.
It's comfy.
It's comfy, yeah.
It's fine. Yeah.
All right.
It's finally comfy in here.
It is. No,
nice.
It's changed from the world of like horror that it was last year when there
pretty
was
much.
like, people were being stabbed off camera while we were trying to do the show, and it's just like
electrocuted,
that kind of stuff,
falling
tripping
over
the floor.
Stuff. Yeah, we got a good rhythm going with the sets now. Which is nice. And we're building a new set downstairs.
Yeah.
And this one will actually be a soundproof room. Yeah, I'm like learning all about this acoustic materials. Mm-hmm. Apparently, when you build a sound studio, like for real, not the one that we have here, we just took over a gigantic space, and there's no one really next to us, so didn't have to worry too much about soundproofing. We put some soundproofing in the ceiling, but downstairs we're talking about using all these construction materials that are produced specifically for acoustics, which is pretty cool, and they're not like outrageously expensive. So I'm kind of excited.
Yeah, you can buy all that stuff for like, there's like particle board that's got like insulation in between it and all kinds of.
It's actually sheetrock with like a layer in between it to help offset.
That's
the
they
sound.
use in like music studios and recording studios, so that you get like.
And there's different levels too. Like we're getting like levels of quotes. Like it depends on how crazy we want.
Well, yeah, you can make it where it's perfectly silent.
Yes,
you can.
I don't think we need that, but
No, probably not. But
Probably
you want to cut down the like screaming in the laundromat kind of.
Sure.
Or it's a pig slaughterhouse or something was down there. Yeah.
What's really funny when you say that is there used to be a laundromat and a wash, dry, and fold right below us. It's an Asian market now, but it used to be a laundromat.
When you get those cheap apartments and you're like, wonder why this is so cheap, and then you go and you find it's above a bowling alley.
And actually on the sign
laundromat.
out front, you can see where it did say like dry cleaning and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Like faded out.
And that's
on the
always
sign.
such a quiet industry with no chemical fumes and stuff like that, and steam being piped up into your, exactly.
So it's good. It's good to be here. I'm excited about our segment. A couple of announcements. Conferences coming up. Source Boston is coming up on May 9th and the 10th. The $75 off discount code for that is SW75WMKW. So make sure you go register at sourceconference.com. I will be talking about Docker security. And I think we had a Docker security incident. Some weirdness happened. There was like this rogue container. We shut it down immediately. And the guys were like, why are you excited? I'm like, I'm excited. I'm like, I think we got hacked. I'm like, this is awesome. This is going to make for awesome content in my talk.
Well, there you
this
go.
Is great.
Yeah, exactly. It's just any kind of rogue Docker incident is definitely going to be interesting.
Yes.
I like it.
So that'll be fun. That's happening at Source Boston. And we get to go to Boston again, which is great. Also, we've got a webcast coming up. Is that today? Is that webcast today? April 4th? Is that right?
It's April 4th.
Oh, April 4th. SecurityWeekly.com/domain tools. I guess if you're listening live, you can register. So that'll be fun. We'll talk about domains and how to detect malicious domains.
Cool.
Probably should work on my slides for that.
Well, talk about Docker going rogue.
Yes.
It could subvert other Dockers.
That's right. Well, this one's about domains, not Docker.
Well, yeah, but you can always work Docker.
We can just work it. We'll work it.
Yeah.
We're going to, speaking of working, we're talking about security threats from virtual machines. And Doug, you've prepared a segment.
I did.
Which is great.
Topical ointment for all your
It
needs.
was titled as topical ointment.
I get lonely. No, I was going through audit notes, and I was reading some stuff from the past, and I was thinking about this, and one of the places that we started seeing massive threats emerging, to me anyway, from was virtual machines, because most people aren't thinking about virtual machines in the context of security threats, or they just don't seem to react to them the same way they react to, say, someone put another laptop on their desk, or another desktop in the office, or another server in the rack. They sort of treat it like, well, it's just this thing. We don't have to worry about it very much. And because there's always been this sort of feeling about virtual machines that they're very like shells on the mainframe, these self-contained entities that can't go bad, they can't do anything, they can't have any effect. But none of that's really true. And I had made a lot of audit notes for somebody a while ago as we were looking at security audit and talking about things that we ought to be looking for, not in terms of exploits. So it wasn't about, like holes in the product as much as it was just flaws in the idea. And I wanted to talk about a few of those things because I know some of you out there are thinking about your security audits, and I'm going to be at RSA talking about the dangers of automated pen testing. And I was thinking this is another one of those places where you have a really good opportunity to fly under the radar as an employee, and you see people exploiting these things in that context. So I made my 5, no 6 threats that I had on my notes from it. So I thought we could talk about it a little bit.
All right, let's do it.
All right. So my first one. So my first threat that I had listed, and all these were based on things we observed in audits. So that's kind of where they came from. So my first one was escalation of privilege. And this particular escalation of privilege was a layer 7 kind of escalation. So by using a virtual machine, an employee was able to go under the radar. So the layer 7 control that was in place is Active Directory. So it's sitting there, it's managing groups, it's managing security groups and security profiles and all these things. Okay, fine, that works great. When an employee was on their machine, they had to actually log into the domain and with their credentials, and the security groups were all applied. Great, no problem. But what happened was the employee was able to install a type 2 hypervisor. So this is a hypervisor that runs inside of your desktop. So it's not a bare metal hypervisor. So they were able to put a hypervisor on their desktop, and they weren't really trying to do anything malicious, but they were able then to install on those virtual machines on their desktop machines in the network that were not part of the domain. So now they've got a domain machine, but inside the domain machine, there was a hypervisor running machines that were not part of the domain. And what happened was when those machines got on the network, he SNATed them into the network, and they became IPs that were not controlled at layer 7. They were only being controlled at layer 3, which was to say they weren't being controlled. And what he was able to do with this was to start sending raw print jobs across to the printers. And in this particular organization, they were charging people for printing. I mean, it was just all internal, but it was an accounting audit kind of problem. And they were charging people for this type of printing, and he was able to send all these print jobs in to the printers on site just using the virtual machine. So he would take the document he wanted to print, and instead of printing it from his desktop, he would put it inside the virtual machine and then send it to the printer, and boom, the printers were all just perfectly happy to print all of his documents out, and they were showing these like blank charges, and that was actually why we were looking for it, because audit was going, why are there all these blank charges, and how are people sending print jobs to the printer? And so this one came out of this was a kind of escalation of privilege with a VM.
Some people would also call that theft.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you call it theft if it's all internal. So he wasn't outside of a Kinko's sending print jobs to them. It was just about internal billing. So it's like one department has to pay IT because IT paid for the printing supplies. So if your department prints a lot, you pay more than some department that doesn't print at all. So yeah, I mean, it is a kind of theft, but it's a pretty lame kind of theft.
Yeah, I agree.
But I mean, in that kind of security audit, the idea was just really, how do we control that sort of thing? Because it could escalate into all sorts of other sorts of heinous things that people could do, including practical jokes and all this stuff. Because that was the example I used, was sending, it wasn't really a dirty picture. It was just a picture of SpongeBob. Yeah, but it was just a picture of SpongeBob because I didn't want to get everybody fired. But I started sending these to printers and saying, you've been SpongeBobbed, and people were like, what does this even mean? And they were getting all panicked. I was like, understand that I'm doing this with a virtual machine. Because I literally put a hypervisor on my laptop, and I started sending print jobs just raw to port 5100, and it was like boom, boom, boom. And
9100?
Yeah, sorry. What's 5100?
I don't know.
I don't know what 5100. So 5100 is something else. It's not a port. It's something else I'm thinking of. I don't know. Maybe it's a monitor number or something. But yeah, 9100. But so that was one of them. The second one. So this was Escalation of Privilege 2 Electric Boogaloo. So this was the sequel to Escalation of Privilege. Was now, what if we can't detect VMs? So this was sort of a part of the first problem in the same way. But one of the things you can do with virtual machines on a hypervisor is you can configure their networks. And so you can literally go into your virtual machines and you can change the way they behave in terms of the local network. And what was going on with that was you can change from NAT, which they used to describe, I think, PAT. So the particular one we were looking at, it was actually patting the device that was a virtual machine out onto the network using the IP address of the local machine. But you can also SNAT those, and you can use a different IP address. And what this person was doing was, and none of these people were really trying to do anything nefarious. They were just literally trying to figure out ways around controls that were in place in the network to get to resources, to get to things they wanted to get to. And what this person did was they started SNATing their virtual machines into the network. And I actually interviewed this person, and he explained, he said, I was just trying to get this to work. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. I just wanted to figure out a way to be able to get out onto the network and do the things that I wanted to do. And what he was trying to access, certain file shares that were on the network. Now, the file shares were being controlled by a not-so-great security group, because that security group, which was out there, was controlling it by IP address. And so what he did was he kept changing the IP address of his virtual machine until the virtual machine actually did what he wanted. So he finally found one that was not, and it was just all about they'd written their rules wrong. And again, like I said, this is not about like true exploits. This is more about like audit type stuff. But when he did that, all of a sudden he could access these file shares. And the reason he was able to access the file shares was because the security rules did not prevent those IPs from accessing things, because they had written their security rules kind of backwards, where they were saying don't allow certain things. So they would go in and they would block someone and say, okay, you can't do this. Now, the problem with this, so the real example of this was that when they scanned the network and they were looking for where these things were coming from, they didn't find them. Because the reason they didn't find them was because he shut down and paused the VMs when he wasn't using them. So when he wanted to go get a file share, he just literally went in there and he opened the file share, and then he got what he needed, and then he turned the VM back off because he didn't want to use up his local resources on the virtual machine. And what happened was, when they were running scans with Nmap, they were running scans with other vulnerability scanners, they weren't seeing these IP addresses because they were not there anymore. And so the conclusion they reached was that maybe we have malware in the network, maybe we've been hacked, all these kind of things. And it really created a kind of an incident that was very difficult to resolve. And we were looking at it because they called me and they said, can you come and look at this? We aren't figuring it out. We want some other eyes on it. So I started looking at it. I started monitoring the network, built some scripts that monitored the network, and watched for certain IPs to appear. And all of a sudden, boom, you see the IP appear. They go to a file share, and then so we went to the file share, looked at it. Anyway, in the course of doing that, we were able to ascertain where it was coming from, tracked it back to that point, and then went to that person's office and said, hi, can we look at your machine for a few minutes? And the person said, well, sure. Why would I not let you do that? And again, that immediately let us see that this person had put a hypervisor and was running a VM on their desktop in order to do something they really weren't supposed to be doing. So that was like a secondary kind of thing. The third one then is Escalation of Privilege 3. Oh, hell no. We can also circumvent Layer 3 in other ways. And one of the common things I've seen people doing with this to get around Layer 3 restrictions was, again, kind of an escalation against Layer 7 restrictions, but it was also an escalation against Layer 3 restrictions. And they were setting up VMs so they could do things in their office that they were not supposed to be doing. And then this was an actual case where they were sort of pursuing nefarious type things. It wasn't to do bad things to the company. In two cases, what they were doing, and it was actually, the one guy told me, he said, I'm trying to protect the company. So he had set up his PokerStars account on a virtual machine so that he could play poker in his office. And he said, this way, there's no chance that I corrupt my local machine or I corrupt the local network. And so he had set up a VM so he could do this. And there was another case in that same company where someone was actually looking at pornography, and they were doing that on a virtual machine so that it wouldn't pollute their desktop, and they were downloading lots of pornography and all this kind of stuff. So the VM in that case was actually getting used to do nefarious things. And it was being used to circumvent a lot of Layer 3 controls that had been put in place. And again, they were actually getting around the domain. They were getting around the tracking. And once again, it was hard to figure out what was going on because in both cases they were using PAT. So we could see the traffic. So we caught those guys by actually seeing the network traffic going back to an IP address. But what they did in the security process was they imaged the people's machines when they weren't there. And then we're looking at them. And the point of this one is, if you're looking at images of these desktops, which is what they were doing, they did not see something that looked very innocuous like a hypervisor. And they didn't even know what the hypervisor actually looked like. So they didn't see it in the image, and therefore they concluded it was some kind of malware that must be on the person's machine. And then I went and looked at it, and I immediately started seeing these large files. And I said, look at this big file right here that's like 24 gigs or 32 gigs or whatever it was. And I said, why would you create a 32 gig file on your machine? And first I thought it might be a movie. Then I looked at the extension and I went, oh, that's a virtual drive. This person has got virtual machines on it. And I had to call back and say, do you allow people to put hypervisors on their desktop? And this was kind of early in that game. And the person said, I don't know what a hypervisor is. We probably don't allow it. But the truth was they did allow it. He was able to install an open source hypervisor on his desktop, put virtual machines on there, and of course he had so many violations it wasn't even funny because he had illegal Windows licenses on his machine. He was reusing Windows licenses from other places, and he got fired. But
That kind of thing can be difficult to detect on the endpoint, and maybe easier today, certainly. But in the past, we would use Tenable's passive vulnerability scanner, and what that would tell you was, hey, there's a Firefox user agent
right
on the network, and you're like, coming back, and you're like, but we haven't deployed Firefox, or it could be any application, right? Is trying to update, and you trace it back to a person's machine, and they're like, they shouldn't have this software installed, and you compare that with the software inventory, and they don't have it installed, and it's because they're using some kind of virtual machine technology, installing a new virtual machine, and then using the software contained on it. And the question always became, well, how do we detect and prevent that? Because what if someone is using vulnerable software in their VM,
right?
And being able to passively monitor the network for vulnerable software, that was always a great use case that I would bring up all the time.
And that passive vulnerability scanner today is a really good way to do that. We were essentially without that. This was before. This was actually I didn't have that nice tool, but basically what we were doing was we were Wiresharking it and looking, like you say, we were doing what the passive vulnerability scanner does, which is looking for certain types of traffic.
Well, and in that today, even tools like Security Onion can give you user agent
and if you see those agents, you see strange things. The big tip off to me in this case was looking for things that were pieces of software that were not known.
Oh, and you know what's interesting? The snort. I'll probably talk about it in our webcast today. The snort signatures that exist will pick up on, hey, there's a Java client that hasn't updated.
Absolutely.
Because it's trying to update and it hasn't updated, and it can say, well, that's vulnerable because it hasn't updated. That could very well be in a virtual machine somewhere, and without any kind of network monitoring, it's. I think that's the easiest way to determine that this is happening.
But even then, if they shut them down, if they just open them and run them temporarily, you may not actually pick them up unless you're just scanning all the time. You may still miss those agents because you're not seeing them all the time. And we started having to track a lot of packets at the border. And this was a network audit that started by tracking packets at the border because the company was just trying to get a better idea of what are the security threats, what's our profile look like. Because I always try to start people with what's your profile. Because you don't just want to come in with the iron fist and the iron glove and say, and we've done that too, where the company just says, that's it, no internet, we're stopping. You have to figure out what people are doing legitimately so that you don't interfere with the enterprise and the productivity of the enterprise by saying, we just shut this down, and then try to let people justify why they need to be able to go to ESPN, which is always amusing. But, I mean, at the same time, it can turn into a big monitoring mess. But we would try to establish that profile and then work backwards from there. And as we did that, we were seeing a lot of strange things. And you say, do you allow people to use this? And they say, well, we don't even know what that is, and why would it be running on our network? And then that starts to clue you in. And so part of the point here as well is to make sure that you start thinking about how do we see those kind of anomalies? How do we do them? And passive vulnerability scanners, snort, all these kind of tools can help you with that security onion. But you do have to have a profile. And if you don't know what your profile looks like in your network, it's going to be very difficult for you to start seeing what the anomalous behaviors are in the network as well. Because when you see things...
the Biggie Smalls yet?
I'm getting to that one. Okay. That's the next one.
I'm curious how Biggie Smalls plays
The Biggie Smalls, The Revenge of the Cycle. This one is about people that were actually legitimate VM users, and what this guy did was he was using the VMs for anything that was slow on his computer locally because it was an AWS. And so he spun up a whole bunch of VMs.
Oh, and this is like the Mo VMs, Mo problems.
Mo VMs, Mo problems. You're absolutely right. And yeah, see, but I mean, so the Biggie Smalls case was really about not so much a security threat as just an enterprise threat. One of my big concerns that I constantly advise people about in terms of AWS, Azure, whatever, and I like these services, don't get me wrong, but when you start using AWS, one of your big temptations is you just turn everybody loose, and it's like saying, okay, you're now the kid in the toy store. You can do anything and everything, and you can just go crazy. And AWS and Azure and all these products will let you go crazy. That's the whole point of them, is they're scalable. So if you need to go crazy, go crazy. So if you say, I need 70 VMs because I've got to test this product and I want to build this network and I want to throw 70 crazy VMs out there and we're going to go nuts, awesome. then do it. And that's exactly what it's for. And it works really well for that. But the problem was
you get the bill.
You get the bill. And the users weren't trained in this. So this person who did this was not trying to harm the company, was not trying to do denial of service or anything else.
Monitoring tools have also been on the the rise, like a hockey stick graph.
Yeah.
Like there was not very many monitoring tools, and now today there's whole companies built around. I think it's Cloud Checker that a friend of mine works for. Basically, they exist to help people get a handle on their bills, because you may have this problem internally in your IT department, but think about a company who's providing their software solely in the cloud and how they have to manage and predict their cost. And now Amazon also has tools that are built in. We use Amazon's built-in tool for monitoring.
And I just saw a presentation from Azure from Microsoft a couple of weeks ago. It was really impressive. They have this really giant UI that allows you to very well start to speculate what's going on. But
vulnerability management platforms also built a lot of this configuration checking in too.
Absolutely. But it does require that you set it up. It requires that you monitor it and you manage it.
You have to pay attention.
Yeah, because if you just go in there and turn it wide open and say, go for it, who knows what's going to happen. Another variation.
So you're going to get a bill for like $50,000.
Exactly. Yeah. And you were expecting to get a bill for $5. Yeah. And I've had individuals tell me they got in these kind of problems too. I had somebody ask me what would happen if I tried to do Bitcoin mining on AWS.
You get a really big bill.
I said, they'll let you do it, but it'll cost more than you could ever make in Bitcoin.
Yep.
So you can certainly use their cycles for anything you want, and they don't care, and they're happy to sell them to you. But remember, it's like electricity. You're buying it, you keep turning on fans, it gets cooler, but guess what? You're using more electricity at the same time. And that was kind of what Biggie Smalls ended up revolving around, was just users who were saying, wow, this is cool. I've got all the toys I ever wanted in my life. I'm going to turn them all loose and go crazy. And then they didn't really realize how the costing was being handled because they had not been trained on it. They didn't really understand the threat from it, and they just went and then we're having a good time. And the other part of Biggie Smalls is don't leave these things running. People were setting up, I had another client, and people were setting up AWS, totally legit, and they would set them up, though, and they were doing experiments and testing, and they were testing betas and all these things, and they would just leave them running. And they go home, and they went on vacation, and the thing's sitting there going, that kind of thing. And then I also had somebody just recently ask me, could you use AWS for storage to store packets to analyze later? And I said, well, of course you can. That's the whole point of it, is that it's scalable. So if you needed to store 500 terabytes of packets, go crazy. But the problem is you have to pay for that.
Yeah,
and it's
you pay for storage, and there's different levels of storage, and then you pay for getting data in, then you pay for getting data out.
Exactly.
Right? So there's multiple levels of payment with AWS and all the cloud hosting providers.
Yep.
So, yeah.
And all of a sudden you get a huge bill. And so that's the threat there, is that you don't understand your costing, you don't understand your budgeting structure with AWS.
What I did in our case is I set a budget, and we put the monitoring service on AWS, and I said you can spend X, like let's try with this amount of budget and see. And I based that on how much it was costing us to host that locally, what it would cost for hardware, and I said, let's spend this per year. And so far, we're pretty well under that limit. If we go a little over, that's fine too. Because again, the benefit here is I don't have to maintain hardware. And what really sparked all of it was we lost a hard drive.
Right.
And I'm like, that set back development. And I'm like, no.
And these are awesome products, and I'm not criticizing them. It's just you have to manage it. I mean, and that's the idea. So you're going to have to take an active role. You can't just say, let's go for it and turn it loose. DNS is the same way. If you turn DNS over to Google or Amazon or any of these people,
in the news is Cloudflare's new 1.1.1.1.
Cloudflare 1.1.1, and all of a sudden you get this huge bill because you didn't understand what you were doing, and you turned it loose, and you didn't realize you had 10 million DNS hits a day. You just thought you thought that we get maybe 1,000, I don't know, and all of a sudden you get a lot more. The bridge over the river VPN. This one was the creation of, I initially started with Outbound Vpn Connection, and again, this was detected the same way by network monitoring. We're seeing VPNs, but the problem was it was VPNs within VPNs. So the person actually was authorized to use VPNs from the company, so he could connect to other sites to download data. He put a VM on his machine and was running a VPN inside of the other VPN so that he could look at porn. And so he actually built a pipe within a pipe. So now the problem was the vulnerability scanners just see a VPN that's going outbound, perfectly normal, but what was coming out of the other end of the pipe of the VPN was another VPN. So that was the first part of the problem. The second part of the problem was he then figured out a way to actually set up a VPN on his machine that allowed inbound. Now, this was a flaw. It was a flaw in the IT security group because they did not block that kind of traffic at the border, because when they originally set up their outbound VPN stuff, they had allowed it in both directions, essentially, because they didn't really understand it, and they just got to get it working, and they turned it on. And all of a sudden, inbound VPN. Now, most people were thinking, well, why would we do that? Our desktops are under control. They couldn't install a VPN client or a VPN server on their desktop. He could install it on a virtual machine. So he put that on a virtual machine, SNATed it into the network, and all of a sudden there was inbound traffic. And he was using those inbound VPNs to allow pornography to be uploaded to his desktop machine.
Wow.
Because he was distributing it. Yeah, it's amazing the links people will go to store and examine pornography. I never, that and gambling. That's the two big things that you see people using this stuff for. All that, though, was, again, circumvention of layer 3, layer 7. All this stuff was getting circumvented because the VMs didn't look like what was expected, because they expect from a desktop that their layer 7 controls are going to keep those desktops stable, and they did. But the problem was he was able to put a hypervisor on his machine. He was able to put virtual machines inside the hypervisor. Remember, you could put servers in there. I mean, you could literally be serving up information. I could adapt that story a little bit from an old story that didn't involve VMs, but it was done the same way. A person was putting servers on the university labs. So this was long ago, not in Rhode Island, but he was putting servers on the university lab machines, and he was hosting a business there because it was cheap.
And I've seen that at university too.
Yep. And it's very easy to do that with virtual machines as well. So putting a server, I mean, like you could put a Windows 2012 server inside a virtual machine and run it on your desktop and allow it to host websites and all kinds of things using the company's network, the company's bandwidth, and the company's
university more than once. I remember someone doing that.
And people do it with DNS. So they jump in and they assign a DNS domain to the outside IP, and then that port forwards, or however they have it, if it's SNATed or whatever, they have it set up, and then it jumps onto their desktop where they SNAT it again. And if anybody comes around looking, that stuff can just be paused in the background and it goes away, and you don't even see it. And a lot of the scanning they were doing did not detect things like that because of the nature of it. So it was very, very nasty. And finally, circumvention of privilege for Rocky the Coming Storm. I don't think the name actually means anything here. This one is about shared folders. You can, with your VMware and your virtual machines, share all sorts of things. I mean, it's practically sort of the subway platform of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And you can share out a folder from a VM into the local machine. Now, what you may not really realize is you can share that folder into a shared folder. And now you've created a kind of jump share that goes from a VM to a shared folder out into the public environment. And what I saw with this one was essentially the person was sharing things they didn't even intend to share, which was a bunch of files that they had put on a VM. They put it in a shared folder on their virtual machine and shared it to their local machine. The problem was the local machine share, they didn't realize was sharing all the VM stuff. And so when they put all these personnel files in that folder, they got shared out onto the public network. And all of a sudden, people that were looking at the public network saw a new share that was called, whatever it was called. I don't remember the name, but somebody opened it and said, oh, look at this. It's all the salary information. It's all the bonus information. And all of a sudden, they've got this huge mess with this person who shared this. So that last one was really about bypassing some layer 7 controls, if you even have those in place, for shares. The way they were managing shares was they would look at the shares. Was somebody looked at them and said, oh, these are legit and these are not. And it just turned into a mess. And it was just sort of this double two-part share where everybody ended up in a jam. So what do you do? Number one is you need to develop sound audit practice, or sound policy, and audit it regularly. I mean, you're going to have to figure out how these VMs fit into your network profile, and how do you audit to detect these kind of things. And that can be very, very challenging to do. So you need to develop signatures. So passive vulnerability scanners, snorts, all these kind of things. You still got to look at what are the specific signatures for what I'm going to allow. Now, you can try to restrict people from installing hypervisors on their desktop to start with, and that's probably a pretty good first step. But if you do have to allow that, you may really need to get in there and figure out what those signatures look like. And you're going to have to develop fingerprints of some sort that you can scan for to look at these things. Another one that I was suggesting was scanning backup archives. So one of the things that was being done was backing up people's desktops. So they were backing up their things they had installed, things they had on their machines. And by scanning those backup archives, and you could do that passively, so you didn't have to have a person sitting there flagging it. But again, looking for those fingerprints. Was there an application installed on that desktop that's not really supposed to be there? What does it look like? What is the signature of, say, VirtualBox or something like that, or ZenGen or some of those other ones that are out there? And again, we were mostly looking at low-end stuff because it's a lot harder to get, things like VM, but VMware Player, all these kind of things are free, and you can download them and put them on your desktop. Don't assume that all your L3, L7 controls are going to work, that they're effective, because they may have been written before virtual machines really got off the ground. So if you have layer 3 controls on your network, layer 7 controls on your Active Directory or whatever, you may not have things in place that you really need because you wrote all those controls a long time ago and they were effective for what you had, and all of a sudden you've got an issue with those kind of things. Don't assume that all the VMs are subject to those same domain controls, that you're going to be able to regulate them the way that you always have, that you can control the desktop. Because remember, you can add a virtual machine that's not in the domain. And if you do, guess what? All of a sudden you've got a huge problem, because now you have a non-domain machine that's literally sort of surfing beneath that layer 7. And don't assume that permissions permeate. So don't assume that permissions set on I'm running out of time, but don't assume that the permissions you set on local desktops permeate down into virtual machines that are in that desktop. They can, but they don't necessarily do that just because you want them to, especially if the people are circumventing domain controls by not joining the domain. So if they're setting up virtual machines, which is a huge amount of privilege, but it may not be defined as such in something like Deep Freeze or some of these desktop controllers, because it just doesn't see it that way. It says, okay, I just control the hypervisor. I don't know what's in the hypervisor. So you may have to look at that. Look at disk space usage is certainly a way that you can scan for this. Are people setting up large files? Are they setting up 16 gig file extensions? All these things have file extensions for their storage. They have file extensions for the files that are in folders of certain types. If you can scan your network for those kind of things. So IDS, other types of scanning may help you get in there. And just mostly though, don't forget to set good policy, and don't forget to audit it regularly. And I'll stop ranting about it at that point.
Sweet. Thanks, Doug. With that, we're going to take a short break, come back, talk about the enterprise security news for this week. So stay tuned. Don't go anywhere.